It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the Philips BDM4037UW. This is a large 40-inch VA panel with a 4K UHD resolution of 3840 by 2160. It has a large glossy screen, as you can see. It is a very bright day, well, fairly bright day. There's lots of light streaming in from the window at the side of me there. So there are reflections, but as explained in the written review, and indeed explored in the matte versus glossy article that we've got on the website, there are advantages to this kind of screen surface. And this monitor does actually use a mild anti-glare coating as well, mild anti-glare surface with a haze value of around 3 or 4%. And what this does is it prevents the sort of mirror-like reflections that you get on some glossy screens. The reflections look a lot softer and a lot more ambient light is diffused by the monitor, so you don't get the same kind of sharp reflections as you do on some glossy monitors. But you do have to be careful about the ambient light. I mean, I've purposefully got this room pretty bright just so I can show you the fact it is a glossy screen, and I'm not going to dwell too much on that. I mean, everyone has their preferences for that, and it does certainly help the image appear clearer and more vibrant. The resolution itself works nicely on a screen of this size. I mean, I personally don't have issues using smaller UHD screens, 32 inches or so. I can use quite happily without scaling. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the aesthetics of the monitor. As you can see, it has a silver bezel. It's actually powder-coated metal that it uses. It does have a plastic surround right on the end, but most of the bezel is powder-coated metal, so it's got quite a nice feel to it. It's a bit of a change from the usual sort of matte black plastics that most monitors use. The stand has a sort of semicircular or crescent shape to it, and that's also powder-coated metal, so it has a nice feel to it. You can only tilt the monitor with the included stand. It doesn't have any height adjustment or anything like that. And I'll just show you around the rear of the monitor, because you'll see there are VESA or VESA holes if you want to mount it using an alternative mount. But just before I do that, I'll also show you that the screen does have a subtle curve, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, what effect, very limited effect, that has on the image. It's a bit hard to show you on this desk because I can't really get above it because of how it's positioned, but it's just a subtle curve, nothing extreme at all. Now we look at the rear of the monitor. There's the joystick, the jog button, which controls the OSD here. There are two 5-watt down-firing speakers which provide a reasonable sound output, nothing particularly high quality though. The power input of this monitor is an AC type, which means it has an internal power converter rather than an external power brick. Centrally you can see that the stand attaches using its own little mechanism here, but you can also attach an alternative stand or mount. There are 100 by 100 millimeter VESA or VESA holes in the middle. There is an MHL capable HDMI 1.4 port, an MHL capable HDMI 2.0 port, which supports the full resolution and refresh rate of the monitor. There are two DisplayPort 1.2 ports, which also support the full resolution and refresh rate of the monitor. A VGA port, 3.5mm audio input and headphone jack, and some USB 3 ports. And the third USB 3 port supports fast charging for connected devices. You can see the yellow coloration rather than blue coloration on the third port down there. There's also a USB 3 upstream port for connecting the monitor to the computer, so you can actually use the USB ports. And finally there is a key slot, a Kensington lock slot, which is a security feature that some businesses in particular might want to use. I've now got the lighting at a more suitable level so you can focus on the screen content. This video review is only designed to complement the written review. It isn't as detailed, and I also have to point out that what you see on the video is reflecting the processing done by my camera, by YouTube, and also your own monitor, it doesn't give an accurate representation of what it is like to actually view the monitor firsthand. I'd also like to apologise, I'm not using a tripod at the moment. I have a desktop tripod and it works nicer with smaller monitors, but this desk isn't actually deep enough so that I can show you the full monitor screen whilst also using the desktop tripod. I will be getting a deeper desk soon, so I'll be able to accommodate larger monitors with the tripod, but at the moment I don't have that, so you're just going to have to bear with the slightly shaky image. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the resolution, which is 4K UHD, and it's a nice resolution for a screen of this size. Personally, I can use smaller screens without scaling. I very comfortably, in fact, can use 32 or so inches UHD without any scaling, but most users would find 40 inches comfortable. It gives you a similar pixel density to a 27-inch WQHD or 2560 by 1440 screen. And you can see the desktop icons are fairly small, but they're not tiny, and the general UI elements and text is a decent size. So to just show you a hopefully familiar website to you, my own website, you can get quite a lot on the screen. You can see there's lots of white space as well, just because of how that and many websites are designed. So the idea with this monitor is you can have multiple websites or multiple applications side by side and still have plenty of room to do your work or to browse. So there's a lot of real estate, as I call it. Lots of pixels, lots of physical screen space. Everything's a decent size, and I can comfortably use the monitor from, well, I mean, as far as I can go on this desk, which is about 80 centimetres from it. No problems at all. It does have a subtle curve, as I mentioned before. It has a very limited effect on the image because it is a very subtle curve, and it doesn't really come across in the video either. It doesn't distort anything, it doesn't make things appear unnatural. I wouldn't say it gives a massive advantage over a flat screen of this size. It's hard for me to say because I haven't actually used a flat screen of this size as a desktop monitor for quite a long time. Since I reviewed the older version of this, or the older IPS model, 43 inches or so. So it's been a while since I've used it, and I find this perfectly comfortable though. Well, whether that's to do with the curve or not, I can't really say. But without further ado, I'm going to get into some gaming and talk a bit more about the contrast performance of the monitor and the colour performance of the monitor. I'm now running Dirt Rally, which has nice dark environments at night. Some games look kind of flooded and quite artificial at night, no matter how good the monitor is, but this has some nice dark elements in it, which is nice. The monitor does a really good job at this kind of scene. In terms of contrast, that's really the strength of this monitor. It does have a vertical alignment panel. It has a static contrast, which is quoted as 4000 to 1. As covered in the review, once you make changes to the settings, which I did for my test settings, which I've got it running at now, the contrast does drop a bit, but it still remains very strong. It's easily above 3000 to 1, so it's firmly within VA only LCD territory. And another advantage that this monitor has is being a VA panel. It doesn't have IPS glow or anything like that, so good levels of detail are maintained towards the bottom on an IPS type panel, including the 43-inch predecessor of this. That has sort of a bloom of IPS glow towards the bottom corners, as you can see from a normal viewing position. This model doesn't have that, so it has a nice atmosphere in dark scenes like this. The strong contrast itself helps bright elements stand out really nicely against the darkness, because the darkness has really good depth to it. And the glossy screen also helps those bright elements appear quite pure as well, nice and smooth. And they just sort of pop out in a way that you don't really get on a matte screen surface, and you certainly don't get on a model with worse contrast than this. So the contrast performance is definitely strong. In terms of weaknesses with respect to the contrast performance, being VA, it does have something which is called black crush, and that's related to the gamma handling. Specifically, the perceived gamma from a normal viewing position is different when you consider the centre of the screen to areas further out. And actually, if you move your head slightly, or I move the camera slightly, unfortunately you're not going to be able to see this because there's still a bit too much light in this room, so you'll just see reflections. If I raise it up enough, you can probably see the level of detail actually increases off angle, whereas if you look at the monitor from a normal viewing position, and especially look at the central regions, you actually do get a bit of detail lost, because some shades appear darker than they should, and they sort of just blend into this blackness, and they're not, subtle details are sort of lost, they're not as distinct as they should be. I don't personally find this to be a massive issue on this model. I've seen it worse on some VA models, is what I'm trying to say. But it is a large VA panel, so you will really expect some of this, and it certainly isn't the best I've seen in that regard either. But I don't feel it's as bad as having IPS glow or anything really as atmosphere breaking as that. But I mean, in an ideal world, you would get all of those subtle details anywhere on the screen, as well as nice, strong contrast, but that isn't something that any LCD panel can actually deliver. I'm now running Battlefield 1, and I realise this isn't the most colourful map, but I've actually chosen this for specific reasons, and that'll become apparent shortly. The colour reproduction of this monitor is very good. It does have a VA panel, as I've mentioned several times already, and what that means is the colour consistency isn't as good as an IPS model. I mean, considering the size of the screen, it's certainly a bit of an issue in that respect. And what I mean by that is the perceived gamma changes depending on which part of the screen you're looking at, as I mentioned with the black crush in the contrast section. But the level of shift in gamma is actually not too bad on this model, especially considering the size. And it's been a while since I've used the BDM4035, so it's hard to compare directly, but I have used several smaller VA models of varying quality since, and I feel that the saturation, the sort of richness of shades, is maintained quite well across this screen. So that's not really a major issue, but I mean, I only really mention it not so much for games, but more if you're using this for any sort of colour critical work, because even if you're calibrating the screen so that shades in the centre, which is what the colorimeter looks at, are perfectly what they should be, screens, as you the shades, sorry, as you perceive at different sections of the screen, aren't necessarily going to be quite as accurate. So it's just something to be aware of for that sort of purpose. In terms of games, it does mean that the screen does lose a little bit of saturation towards the edges, but as I've said, it's not a massive change, and it's actually quite surprising for a screen of this size and this panel type. The saturation loss is not bad at all, and maybe that's partly because the saturation in general is very strong on this monitor. It does have a generous colour gamut. It extends easily beyond sRGB. It isn't a wide gamut model, so you don't get huge oversaturations and things looking completely wrong, but shades are displayed with quite strong saturation, and there is technically a bit of oversaturation. And for example, one of the reasons I picked this map is the desert sands. Again, you're not going to be able to see this on your monitor, which I don't know what colour gamut that has. You might not even know. And the processing done by the camera, there's no way you're going to see exactly what I'm seeing, but the sands here appear a bit too red, and they should appear a more neutral brown than they do. But it's not strong. On a wide gamut model, one with an Adobe RGB or greater colour gamut, displaying this content would show an obvious red glow. It would look like you're on Mars or something like that, and it's not that bad at all. But overall, the colours are very rich. You know, the sky is nice vibrant sky blue, various different blue colours. The variety of shades, the subtle shade variety, as I've mentioned, there is some changes in saturation, but they're not too major. So it's actually got very good variety of shades which it displays. And you can't really see any nice vibrant greens here, but some of the more forested areas on this game, in the forested regions, there are some really nice, really lush looking greens. The glossy screen surface helps in that respect as well. It gives something I like to call vibrant pop, especially if you're viewing the screen in a slightly brighter room than I'm in at the moment, like I had before when I had the blinds open, because you get a bit of sort of a slight reflection on the screen, and that actually increases the perceived contrast, which I should have really mentioned in the contrast section. Also just makes colours have this sort of wet painted on look, which I know some people really like. It's one of the main things people quite like about glossy screens. But yeah, the colour performance overall is very pleasing. And I mean, I could say quite a lot more about this, but really I just recommend you read the written review instead, because I can't really show you anything extra, because you can't really see what I'm seeing and what the monitor shows firsthand anyway. So I'd really recommend you read the written review for more about that. I'm now on Battlefield 1 again. I'm going to talk a bit about responsiveness on the monitor. I'm slightly losing my voice, so you've got to bear with me. I might struggle a bit at times, but a lot of what you see here, unlike the rest of the video, will actually be quite obvious from the video, so I don't have to spend too much time talking. It'll sort of speak for itself to a great degree. Earlier on, I showed you some, when I was talking in the colour reproduction section, there's predominantly lighter shades involved with the transitions, and nothing really stood out in terms of weaknesses from pixel responsiveness or anything like that. As covered in the written review, there are some weaknesses with brighter shades. There's some overshoot and a bit of extra trailing in places, but nothing quite as bad or noticeable as you'll see here, because there are some darker shades. It's kind of a mixture of transitions, but there are quite a lot of darker shades here. And even as I just move the mouse around, you can see the sort of inky looking trails in the background. That's something I like to call breakup trailing. I'll give you another example. On this horse, you can actually see a sort of pink reddish coloration towards the rear of the horse, and towards the front you can see sort of an inky blue in the trailing, a smearing if you prefer. Now, this is actually caused by the fact that these shades aren't pure black. They do have some sort of red hues and blue hues and other hues in them. It also happens on the ground here. You can see it quite extensively on the shadow, and you can see breaking up of the shades, so I call it breakup shades. You can see it's kind of inky smeary trailing around it, which is quite colourful, more colourful than it looks when you're not moving the camera. And I mean, there are more examples of this, but I'll show you them in a little bit. Another thing, overshoot. The monitor, although I've got the smart response setting off, which I found optimal as I explore in the written review, you can see some overshoot around the moon, for example, when you're moving. I don't know how this will appear on the camera, but I can see inverse ghosting there. There's a quite clear sort of silhouette of the moon as it moves. I'm just going to go down a bit on the game to show you some slightly different transitions lower down, hopefully not killing myself in the process. These telegraph posts here are quite interesting, and some of the weaknesses they show. I should also mention that I am running the game at a constant 60 Hz. I've got it set up so that it is running at a constant 60 Hz, so it isn't a problem of low frame rate or anything like that. The monitor is running at the highest frame rate possible. Sorry, the GPU is running at the highest frame rate possible for this monitor. you can see sort of breakup trail there, a bit of overshoot as well. And I'll just look up a bit and you can see it even more obviously there. And as I explore in the written review, this is fairly widespread, where there are not just darker transitions but also some medium transitions. And it's not just an issue when you're playing maps like this at night. A lot of darker, there are lots of darker elements in brighter situations as well. For example, you might have dark buildings or shaded vegetation, something like that. That would actually be involving these slower transitions as well. So I'm just going to give my voice a little bit of a rest and just sort of show you a bit more. I mean, there's not too much more to say about it, or too much more to show you, really. I mean, they're the sort of the worst examples. Specifically, the breakup trail here, it looks, I like to liken it to someone who's written down something with fountain pen ink, and then they've dropped some water on the page and it's sort of smeared into this sort of inky looking smeary effect there. So, I mean, VA panels do typically have some weaknesses, but it's been a while since I've used ones that actually have quite the extent of weaknesses in pixel responsiveness that this one does. And it is a bit of a shame because the monitor, it does have quite low input lag. Oh, some guys here killing me, that's wonderful. I'll just take them out and then... So yeah, it does have quite low input lag, especially compared to the other comparable monitors, which had well over a frame. This one I recorded under a frame of input lag. I don't know if you can see this on the video, there's a little bit of overshoot there. In terms of overshoot, it's not too bad. This should give you this will give you a nice example of smeary training. So yeah, the input lag is not bad, but the as you can see, the pixel responsiveness, there are some definite issues there. I mean, yeah, that's pretty extreme. There's quite a bright metal background there with some much darker elements in it, and you can just see that really some of the worst transitions in play there. And I just like to show you, as I said, I'm running Smart Response off at the moment. That is optimal because, well, I'll show you why. If I increase this to fast, the Smart Response setting, the pixel overdrive, you can still see the sort of smearing trailing, but it actually increases the overshoot. There's more noticeable overshoot around the moon. You know, you still get, basically the fast setting doesn't really do a lot, it just introduces a bit of extra overshoot. If I then use faster, you can again see the trailing, and there's actually quite strong overshoot in places. I don't know if you can see around this canister there. Yeah, there's quite a bit. And again, around the moon, even stronger again. And there's quite significant overshoot there as well. So it doesn't really help, it doesn't really cut down on the smearing significantly, it's still there. But it just introduces more noticeable overshoot. And the fastest, the smearing does persist, but there's actually quite extreme overshoot. I mean, it just speaks for itself. It's quite a mess, really. So, I don't really recommend this monitor for gaming in terms of the pixel responsiveness. Yes, the input lag is nice and low, but and to some extent it's quite subjective. Some people would find the responsiveness, the pixel responsiveness, okay, and it is a bit situational. I mean, not all transitions are as bad as the ones I'm showing you here, obviously, but it's a bit of a shame. And at least for lower frame rate content such as movies, which would run at 24 to 30 frames a second, or possibly 23 frames a second, depending on the content. That kind of movie content, it's fine for that, as I explore in the written review. But 60 frames per second movie content has the same weaknesses that you can see in the game here, so it's not very good for that either. And on the desktop, I'll just actually go on to the desktop. I'm not really going to show you this, but desktop animations, and when you're actually using the desktop, it does run at 60 frames a second on this monitor. You know, it's a 60 Hz monitor, and yes, you do get weaknesses. This is a nice monitor to use for desktop purposes, work and browsing the internet, that sort of thing. So I wouldn't be put off for that kind of usage, but for gaming I would definitely approach with caution. To wrap up then, before I lose my voice completely, so I'll try to keep this kind of brief if I can, or brief for me anyway. The Philips BDM4037UW is a nice big monitor. I like the size. I think it works nicely with the 4K resolution without having to use scaling, the UHD resolution. It's yes, it has a subtle curve, sorry. It doesn't really change the experience that much. It perhaps does make it a little more natural, a little more comfortable, but as I've said earlier, it's been a while since I've used such a big monitor for PC usage anyway, so it's difficult for me to compare that aspect. But I think it's a decent addition because it does keep things looking natural and it doesn't really look out of place at all, so that's fine. I like the glossy screen surface on this as well. There is a little bit of reflection, as with any glossy screen surface. If you're not careful with your room lighting, that could be an issue, especially if you're viewing darker content. But the reflections aren't as sharp as on some glossy surfaces, particularly untreated glossy surfaces. This model does have a 3 to 4% haze treatment, so it has a very mild anti-glare treatment, and that does cut down a little bit on the reflections without really impeding the image quality. Things look nice and smooth, they don't look obviously grainy or anything like that, and the screen has nice pop to it, to the colours, and certainly that is really complements the strong static contrast of the monitor. It retains that even following adjustments in the OSD. They're quite significant adjustments to colour channels, which I used for my test settings, and that really does help give nice distinctions between dark and bright shades. I mean, this butterfly on the desktop, which I didn't choose this on purpose, but it's a good display of contrast. And again, you're not going to be able to see this on the video, and you're just going to have to take my word for it until you can see it firsthand. But the colour gamut is also generous. It's not a wide gamut monitor, but it does extend easily beyond sRGB, and for that reason the colours have good vibrancy, and again it's complementing the glossy screen surface and definitely has nice pop to colours. So overall the image is pleasing. I think really the main weakness, and sort of the key weakness of VA in general, but actually certainly applies to this monitor, is pixel responsiveness. I was actually quite impressed by the input lag of this monitor, but not so much the pixel responsiveness. It has quite widespread issues with smeary trailing, breakup trailing, overshoot. It basically would stop me recommending it for gaming. I mean, some users would find it okay, especially for light gaming, but I mean, I think I'd be misleading you if I was to suggest that you should really buy this if you're heavily into your gaming. But for slower content, for general movies, 30 frames a second or slower, for general desktop work, I really quite like this monitor. So, I mean, I wouldn't dismiss it for the responsiveness, but just do be aware that it does have weaknesses in that area. I also like the overall design of the monitor. I do like a bit of metal rather than plastic, so I like the metals used on the bezel and the stand. It has a nice feel to it. I also like that they've lifted up the bottom of the monitor a little more from the desk. The other BDM models were a bit lower down, and that wasn't really particularly comfortable. You can again mount this to an alternative VESA compatible stand with the 100 by 100mm VESA holes if you prefer, as the included stand only offers you tilt adjustment. So that's really all there is to it. I hope you've enjoyed this review and haven't found my strange sounding voice towards the end of it too annoying. Be sure to check out the full written review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to it on the description of the video. There's also a link to a post on the forum about how you can support the work that we do, and that is very much appreciated.